Hey everybody, I'm Mark Tarmerdahl. I got my BS in biology at a little place called Davidson College. Then I went to the University of North Carolina as a grad student in biomedical engineering and mathematics, and I stayed there. I am the proverbial cockroach in the lab. But when I was shopping for labs, after I did a whole bunch of engineering and electronics kind of training, shopping for labs, I was looking for what my passion really had become, understand the brain. And I walked into a gentleman's office and they were looking for an in-house engineer, which were the skills I had acquired and had at that time. And he said, look, what we're trying to do is understand how the brain works. That's the whole function of this lab. But the best way, the absolute best way to study it is through the sense of touch. And I was kind of like, wow, okay, that's interesting. But he said, you can probe brain function through the sense of touch better than with any other sensory modality. Problem was, at that time, was the technology for delivering those stimuli. But we had stimulators that worked. We had devices that we could deliver vibrations to the skin and things like that, and we could study brain function. We actually did study brain function. I spent 25 years just doing basic science on doing animal science, looking at responses in the brain at very high resolution, looking at patterns in the brain and trying to understand what's going on. And then we started saying, oh, well, this would be really cool if we could matriculate this and translate this out into something that could be usable. One of the things that's interesting in academic research, which you may not know, there was an article online, I don't know, 12 months ago, Professor, your papers are not being read. So all this stuff about getting published is, yeah, big deal. On average, most academic papers are read 11 times. So if you really want to have an impact, you got to do it yourself. You can't just write a paper and say, hey, if somebody would just read this, they could have a huge impact. I really thought that for about 10 years. All the papers that we've written, it's like, we've got a way to really test how the brain works. And then somebody could track the brain and track brain function. Well, it turned out the people that were going to do that was us, because nobody else was going to do it. And I had a lot of ideas, and until somebody moved in across the hall from me, from another university, and he had all the skills for building devices, and we had a lot of conversations, a lot of whiteboard talks about how we could save the world if we could just track brain function. That's basically, we were both very grandiose ideas, but we just thought we could actually answer a lot of questions about a lot of neurological functions. And I had this nutty idea that, if we did this right, a few years, we could have this the size of a computer mouse, and anybody could own one. And he said, no, you're absolutely nuts. But he went ahead and built the first prototype of what is now the brain gauge, and it weighed about 100 pounds. And now the brain gauge, which is, this very small device you pictured here, is the size of a computer mouse. So that was the first stage, but also along this, for a lot of personal reasons, I'd sort of been encountering a lot of different ways that people were looking at brain health for whatever reasons they had. And I was really kind of appalled. I mean, it was like, you pay $1,000 a scan. This was back in 2003, 2004. And, and it really couldn't really tell you anything. You can't track somebody's anxiety by looking at an MRI. You can't track, actually, even an MRI is not going to tell you whether or not somebody has a concussion or whether they've recovered from it. There's a lot of things that you can't do. And I said, well, but there are a lot of tests that we know we could do based on all our work if we just delivered the right kinds of tests. And so the one thing that bothered me was when I started looking at all these things was that nobody was really testing anybody at all. If you guys were to, let's say, just forget about brain science, if you were to, say, set up a weight loss program for a group of patients, group of clients, what would be the first thing you do? You weigh them, right? What about, okay, let's take the next step. You're going to be a physical trainer. What's their speed? How fast can they run? What's their coordination? Okay, all those things. Measure all those things. Okay, now, let's take it another step. How many people actually give tests to people to see how their brain is functioning and track them? So, I mean, I spent many decades in competitive sports, and one thing we knew was whatever you did on the weekend, you could see the difference on Monday morning. You might feel great, but your time stunk. I mean, if you did what most college kids do on the weekends. And thankfully, your competitions were on the following week. You usually had a few days to recover, and when you're young, you have a lot of time to recover. But nobody tracks brain health. Nobody, not really, not with an objective measure. And normally when you bring somebody in, you say, how do you feel? Great. Okay, that's really not really what you want. So this slogan I have up here, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. Anybody want to take a wild guess what journal I got that out of? Field of expertise. Somebody name one. Gardening? You're very close. It actually came from a farming magazine I subscribe to called Acres Magazine. I have to give them credit. But if you don't measure what you do, and gardening's a great example. If you don't measure what's going in the soil, if you don't know how much rainfall you have, you can't figure out what your yield is. If you pull out 1,000 pounds of potatoes one year and you put in 100 pounds of seed potato, you're not going to know anything about the next year when you start to go and get your seed potato ready. You need to know what these things are. Same thing for brain function. So we developed a brain gauge. We're going to jump to how does it work? How do you actually measure brain function? And what you see here is a little cartoon moving it very slowly compared to what it actually does, but it's vibrating the fingertips. And when you deliver stimuli to the two fingers, the two adjacent fingers, you're activating nerves in the fingers, which project to places in the brain that are either adjacent or near adjacent. And we know pretty much where they are because we studied this over and over and over again. And when we deliver stimuli to these fingers and you activate places here, you can ask who's ever receiving this stimulus, you can ask little questions. And when I say you, I mean a computer program. I don't mean, you don't have to administrate this, you just plug it in, and the computer and the program or the app will ask questions about what's going on in the brain, and these questions are really, really complicated. Like, which one's larger? Which one came first? Which one lasted longer? So those questions are really pretty simple. The stimuli sometimes are complex, but they're delivered in a really simple fashion. It's meant to be as easy as reading an eye chart. That's why the eye chart picture is up here. And so most of you, I'm sure, have taken an eyeglass exam or had your eyes tested with an eye chart, and it actually works pretty well. But it starts out extremely easy and then gets harder and harder and harder. And as it gets harder, you reach your threshold. You say, oh, I can't get any farther than here. Okay, and as we get older, that line goes up and up and up, or at least it does for me. So, at least when I'm reading, it does. But anyway, that's called a threshold. And that threshold's really easy to maintain, and this is a sensory test. Sensory testing is really phenomenally good at figuring out thresholds. Just like your eye chart exam is really good at giving you a really clear, concise, accurate measurement for what your vision is and what kind of eyeglasses you need. We can deliver sensory tests to the skin, except we're not testing skin sensitivity. We're testing what's going on in the brain and whether your brain can dial in and tune in onto those stimuli. And then we test different parts of the brain and we test different mechanisms. And those different mechanisms are all listed here, and I'm sure that you're just sitting on your edge of the seat waiting to hear what lateral inhibition and plasticity and all that other stuff is. But trust me, these are a whole bunch of different mechanisms that you can't walk about without. Plasticity was already mentioned today. Somebody already answered that question, what plasticity is. But plasticity is an important thing. And together, coupled with lateral inhibition, those are building blocks of learning and memory. So we don't do tests for learning and memory. We do tests on what those informational processing building blocks are. So that's basically what the brain gauge is doing. Basically, somebody sits down, they take the test, and really the only interaction somebody has to have with them is tell them what their subject number is and say, okay, you're patient John Q113 or whatever system you want to use. Now, what happens after we've done those tests is that after we've done those tests, you get a bunch of answers, okay? You get a bunch of numbers. We have a couple of different ways to display the data. One is the bar chart, one's the radar chart. Radar chart's on the right, bar chart is obviously on the left. And we try to make this intuitive. So if you just glance at that, which of these values are good? Would you think it's green is good? Well, actually it's written on there, so I guess you can figure that out. Green is good, red is bad. If the bar is full, that's good. So we put it in two different methods, and or two different modalities, and you got green bars that are 100%, red bars that are very short. So that's basic, and then those numbers, we get a composite cortical metric or overall score. That gives you an overall score that you can look at. So what do you do with these? And it's like, great, I measured somebody, doesn't mean anything, does it? All right, well, let's say you're tracking this. In this case, we do have a lot of data from concussion, but don't let anyone tell you we just deal in concussion. We've never met a neurological disorder or neurological insult where we didn't detect a significant alteration in brain function. Now, this is day 1 post-concussion. Concussion occurred on day 0, and you can see that their scores aren't all that great. Here's day 6, day 14, and basically what you see is a progression from bad to good. Day 14 is when this person was actually cleared. And a lot of people like using the brain gauge, and basically, I don't know how much you guys know about concussion, but just to put a plug in for one of the people we work with, one of the team doctors at one of the Western North Carolina university towns said, you know, I look at all that paperwork from Impact and I look at all this other stuff, but I like the brain gauge because when I see green, I know they're good to go. And so that was probably one of the nicest things I've ever heard about our system. Basically though, most people aren't that interested, at least at first, on what these different scores are or what they mean. They're really just interested in the overall score. So what we do is we give you a timeline plot of the overall score. This is the history of that particular individual. And in this case, this was where somebody started getting treated, and treatment didn't really take. Didn't take, oh, and then the treatment started working. I don't know about you guys, but a lot of people, a lot of patients, the treatment just doesn't seem to work for a while. It takes multiple treatments to get there. And it just depends on what the treatment is and what they're doing, but sometimes it takes longer than others. Okay, so the data analysis app pulls up and you end up selecting whatever patient that you're gonna be testing or looking at their data. You pull up their patient, you see the whole score, you see the report, and you can go back and you can look at any point in time. So you can go back and you can look at data from before they started treatment, you can look at after, or any time after that. And you can get a nice little printout and all that kind of stuff. So what do you do with data? The whole purpose of tracking brain health is to see what works. So one, is treatment working? How effective is that treatment? How long is it going to take them to get better? Is it time to quit treatment? Or patient buy-in? You know, does a patient really think they really need help? In this case, you know, we started this person, the treatment was started, they got better, then they said, no more treatment, I'm fine, I'll prove it. It was kind of a weird case study, okay? Well, and this was not an IASIS treatment, this was a pulse electromagnetic field treatment. Obviously, the treatment needed to be continued a little longer for that case. All right, but basically in all these cases, what we're doing is we're trying to optimize the tuning curve. Everything has a tuning curve. All neurons have a tuning curves, assemblies of neurons, groups of neurons, areas of the brain, they all have tuning curves. So how do things work? And what I mean by dosimetry versus score, bigger scores are better on this axis, and you're looking for that sweet spot. Where is somebody the best that they can be? Where is a patient the best, or where is an individual the best at whatever they do? Most commonly used example I have on the dosimetry is basically from personal experience giving all my students a brain gauge in the fall. I have about 50 to 60 students, depending on class size, and everybody gets a brain gauge, and they have projects to do and labs to do, but they all end up using the brain gauge to figure out they all somehow gravitate to finding out what is their optimum brain function, or what is the optimum speed of their brain function with how much caffeine. And they all find out about the same thing. A couple of express, if they get up early in the morning and they only got 3 hours sleep, they're not doing all that great. They take a little bit of caffeine and they do a lot better. And then they do the 8 espresso shot experiment and all of a sudden they really stink. But this is all stuff that people just like to look at. All right, let's do a few case studies. This case study number 1, and this is kind of an interesting case study. This was all with IASIS microcurrent neurofeedback. And this kid here, he was 9 years old during pre-treatment. And then basically in the first treatments, he got a lot better, a whole lot better. And then what happened here? Number 3, he got worse. He got better, worse, better, worse, better. The overall trend is really what you want to look at. The overall trend is very important. Little things can happen. Daily things can really mess up somebody's scores. And let's see what happened to mess up the scores. Well, this was number 3. That was a unsupervised visitation by the mother. She wasn't supposed to get that, but she got him for a week, and she was really not allowed to do that, but it was unsupervised, and she had him, and he was very upset after that. So that really impacted his scores. Number 2, he was still staying with his father, which was the more stable situation, but he missed a medication. He has ADHD. And did much worse. And for those of you who don't know, I changed the format here a little bit. This is the starting scores. This is the final scores. So on the final score over here, which corresponds to this, his treatment's been rolled back. So he's not coming in as often because he's doing really well. When he was here, he was doing very poorly in school. He was kind of antagonistic. He didn't make friends easily. And he wasn't, his grades weren't good. Now he's a class leader, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, making friends, having a good time. That's kudos to the IASIS treatment. I mean, that's basically what that's all about. He probably would have done better on number 5, but he had just come back from a sleepover. Okay, any of you know a 10-year-old at a sleepover, that's just code for no sleep. All right, so that's actually pretty good considering how he did. But you'll see variations because as you start treating the brain, different parts of the brain may get better. They're going to start shifting things around, and it takes a while for it to be much, much better. It takes a while for everything to get in order. It takes a while for all the scores to catch up. Do another case study. This is just a professional with a very high stress lifestyle, drinking and eating disorder problem. This is a really low score, in case you guys don't know. When you're getting down near 0, that's really bad. So anyway, she tested, got treated, and then obviously did much better, being one of these type A high professionals. Oh, look, I did better, I'm fine. Actually, your scores here really don't warrant not getting more treatment. And so with time, she was convinced. A little bit of patient buy-in was bought by showing scores and saying, okay, you need to keep testing, you need to keep being treated, stay with us, and keep going. So the patient got weekly IASIS treatments, and she's obviously doing much better. This is just illustrating all the different overall scores. When you get your brain gauge, you set it up, and you've tested somebody 2 or 3 times, you have their overall score, boom. And you can track their overall score. It's like learning how to ride a bike. It's really, well, actually, that's not even that. You've been given this. It's easy to track the overall score. There's nothing to it. But then the thing is, okay, you've got different curves. You got some curves go up, some curves go down. And why is that? Well, sometimes it can be because there's non-compliance. Somebody gets treated, and then they come in and then they say, well, I've had enough. And then they come back to you a while later and say, well, maybe I should have, they come back after a few months after no treatment and say, well, maybe I should have continued my treatment, and their scores are much lower. Basically, there's some people, you're going to see some people get better right away, and they might get a little worse for whatever reason. Like I mentioned in the last case study, people do have other things going on. They have a high stress situation going on here, which keeps them from fully getting better, but it gives you an indication of where they are overall. I put this up here. I'm sure everyone's familiar with the boiling frog syndrome. put a frog in a pot and in cold water, and it'll just sit there, and you just turn it up and turn it up and turn it up. They don't get out because if you turn it up slow enough, they will boil before they get out because you are slowly creeping that up. Any degenerative disorders pop to mind off the tip of your tongue? Alzheimer's? Yeah. I mean, I experienced this firsthand with my parents. It's not fun to live through, but because like my dad was convinced he was fine. He was fine. He was fine. But, you know, his only memories of when he was 18 and younger. So he basically, you know, things kept going downhill and downhill, but, you know, you can't convince people. Sometimes there have been a lot of cases where people are convinced. They get a score and they say, oh, maybe I do need help. One of the best ones was that I encountered was through another clinician, had a kid that said, he was 16 years old, and he said, hey, I didn't like any of those tests you gave me. She gave him a whole bunch of neuropsych evals, and he said, those are crap, I don't like them. I like the brain gauge, so I did well on that, I aced it. She said, well, let me show you your scores. She showed him his scores, and he said, okay, maybe I do need treatment. So, I mean, she actually convinced him to get help using the scores. So, because he didn't do all that well. We may choke on this one, but I'm gonna try anyway. So, like I mentioned, the overall score is the easy part. That's learning how to ride a bike. If you really wanna do the Tour de France or do the professional bike racing, it's really not that hard. But it can get complicated. Knowing what these different scores mean isn't that hard, but when you're doing the app, if you want to know what any of these scores are, you just click on it. A little bar will pop up and say, oh, timing perception. That has a lot to do with the cerebellum. You want more information? Click here. You click there, and it'll take you to a whole long paper. Or you can also go to the BrainGauge YouTube channel, and there's a whole video just on timing perception. So, you know, in timing perception, we see that score go down on people, you know, very early, like on pre-Parkinson's patients. People have a coordination problem. That's one of the things that happens there. Hit somebody on the front of the head, TOJ goes down. Or actually, TOJ is extremely sensitive to stress and anxiety, which is what I was going to get to. One of the things to know about is that when in the brain, you have interactions going on in your brain all the time. Everything in your brain that's happening is either excitation or inhibition. There's no in between. And so whenever you have an excitatory input here, it's surrounded by inhibition. Think of it, and this happens on every scale. It's basically a fractal organization of massive proportions. So even the tiniest neurons, you have the sea of activity in the brain, and what's going on is, think of it as a big crowd of people, and there's one person putting their hands on the shoulder of the person next to them, and they're pushing up, and they're pushing those people next to them down. That's what this is called. This is all inhibition. It's all called lateral inhibition. And what this was what I originally had for this talk, but I said, you know what, pictures are better. Schematics are great, because that's a schematic we deduce from all our work. But what the schematic is talking about is that this happens between all areas of the brain. So you have, in our pain work, what we found was if you input pain, you inactivate the ability to touch. Anybody ever touch something hot? Yeah, come on, everybody's touched the hot plate. Okay, if you go and you touch the hot plate, you move your hand off it really fast, right? You don't think about exactly where it hits you on the hand. That's a massive receptive field. You just touch something that's hot, and your automatic thing that you pay attention to is that pain response. The pain response is what you are most tied to. And so that would be the pain here, and this would be localization. Yeah, you know it's on the arm somewhere. You got to move the arm, but it's instant, all right? That's what happens between pain and tactile sensations. And so obviously, pain will have a huge impact on your scores. That's how we probe brain function with pain patients, is that we we automatically see an accuracy score go down. Speed score doesn't go down, not right away. If you have chronic pain, let's say you've got this large area of activation and is suppressing this area. Acute, you can get that. You touch something hot, you pull your hand off. Well, what if you just had constant pain? What if you had fibromyalgia or TMJD or migraine? What if that pain was constant? When it's constant, you have these areas that are suppressed all the time. They get so suppressed that they can no longer function. And that these areas that are excited, they get super excited. So that the chemistry, the response is actually changing of the neurotransmitters. What do I mean by that? The most dominant neurotransmitter for inhibition is called GABA. And you may have run across that a few times or heard the word GABA, GABA agonist. Very common GABA agonist is benzodiazepine. I'm sure you're not prescribing that to anybody. That's not a good thing. But you might have patients that have taken it. Baclofen is a GABA B agonist. But the point is, GABA is inhibitory, and you have to have this balance between excitation and inhibition. Anybody want to know what happens to GABA in areas that are super excited and stay super excited? The GABA becomes excitatory. So the excitation gets even worse. And then the suppression of the adjacent areas gets even worse. Now, knowing that one area is really, really super suppressed, or super excited, one area is really super suppressed. How does IASIS work? You guys are dribbling a little bit of current in here, and all of a sudden, boom, everything's reset. You just rebooted the system. That's how that works. Now, where you get the differences on these measures, okay, well, chronic pain, yeah, you say, oh yeah, I don't have any pain patients. That's fine. You got anybody that have problems with the limbic system? Stress, anxiety, emotions? Yeah, of course. Every network is connected to the cortex. Every network impacts it in different ways. So I mentioned the acute problem with pain is accuracy. That goes way down with the acute pain. But you know, if that drags on for a while, months or even years, plasticity gets a lot worse. All right? Anxiety or stress will impact temporal order judgment and focus. Those two things are really messed up. Stress and anxiety continue and continue and continue. Maybe it's a combination, a comorbidity of stress, anxiety, TBI, and turns into PTSD. All those things. Really, they make just quite a potpourri of these things. And as, you know, if your focus and your TOJ scores stay down, immediately, you know, after a while, the plasticity scores start getting worse. So, and that's all because of the connectivity between these different areas. All parts of the brain are interconnected, but you can, and that's why you can probe all these different functions with the brain gauge. So how do we compare? How do we compare to other systems? And so here's just another simple, really straightforward case study. This is how this football player looked preseason. Then he returned to play September, like a month later, he was cleared. All right, now the numbers up here, yeah, physician cleared. In this particular area, in this particular team, it's the physicians who give the clearance. But let's look at how this compares to like an overall group study of, say, 400 athletes. 400 student athletes. And this is really just to give you an idea about how well this fits in with other studies. And keep in mind, when you look at one patient, you look at one patient. When you've seen one concussion, you've seen one concussion. They're all different, but there's got to be some commonalities and some way to look at them in an objective way. So let's start with number 4. That's when most kids in this study were cleared by the physician. So this kid did take a little longer to clear, and his scores were pretty bad to start with. And that's usually a pretty good indicator that it will take longer to recover. Number 3, that's when he's cleared by the impact. Most of you have heard that word. Concussions have been in the news. Impact is, let's say they're the marketing monster of impact. They own the market, all right? And it is an online neurocognitive test. So, or online cognitive test. And basically it requires a preseason baseline, That preseason may be 2, 3, or 4 years before the concussion, but they take that test and then they take it again. Now, one thing that we know, and this is not me saying it, this is athletic trainers that I've worked with, and this is publications saying it, is that on average, day 7 is when people recover from impact testing. After a concussion, on average, they almost always recover by day 7. How convenient. Get an injury on Saturday, you're ready to go on Saturday. All right. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but that's just what I'm saying. All right. Number 2. Number 2 is balance testing. Balance testing is really, really good for testing balance. Did I say anything about brain function? Or being integrated with the brain or anything like that? No, I didn't. But that is a thing. Balance testing is what's pushed by over and over and over and over by a lot of people because that's part of the system. Anyway, and that was actually being nice, saying that they were cleared by balance testing on that particular day. They're actually 15% better than they were before the injury on day 2 after the concussion. The concussion makes them better at balance? Yeah, so it's not a really useful measure for concussion. Anyway, that's one way we compare. This is what's called ROC analysis. It's sort of a standard way for assessment tools or diagnostic tools. And this is in one study that we were in. A perfect score would be a 1.0, where you actually fit and you have no false positives, no false negatives, or anything like that. What you're looking at is saying, okay, for everybody who is brain injured, and you're comparing them to a group of people who are not brain injured, and you say, can you get them in the right category? And so when we look at all these different parameters, all those different mechanisms, we get pretty good score. In this case, in that particular study, I think it was 93%. That's not bad. All the other measures that were being pushed fell into this gray zone. Now, 93% is the best you can do on this particular score. Anybody want to wager a guess what the worst score is? It's actually 50%. Flipping a coin is 50%. So all these other measures fell into this gray zone, all right? So actually we do okay. And why do we do better? Because when we're compared to other methods, other concussion methods in particular, the other concussion methods target concussion. They have questionnaires about concussion. Or if we're compared to a pain method, the questionnaires are about pain. Questionnaires don't necessarily work so great, okay? Why would that be? Boiling frog syndrome is that you're not aware that you're getting worse. Your perception is, your brain is not a good tool for assessing itself, okay? Your brain's pretty good if you got a compound fracture in your leg, saying, yeah, a bone's sticking out of the leg. That's really good for that. But telling yourself that you're not getting old and demented, I mean, I suspect I am, but still, I test myself to make sure I'm not going down that path too fast. Anyway, so what are the other comparisons? And I mentioned we do work in all the major areas. Besides trauma, we work in neurodevelopmental disorders, which is autism, ADHD, OCD, Tourette's. We work in pharmacological areas, substance abuse, alcoholism, neurodegenerative disorders, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, etc. I probably left a whole bunch out. Pain's a huge one. Anyway, so why do we do better? One is we're biologically based. We basically target those specific mechanisms. And it's very low administrative cost. A lot of tests need a lot of administration. For the brain gauge, low administrative cost means somebody sits down at a desk or computer, you give them their ID, and then they go. They read all the instructions. Now that's pretty good down to about whatever age can't read. So we've done studies, been successful down to the age of 4, but I wouldn't recommend going too low. We don't need a pre-injury or a baseline, pre-injury baseline. That's because when we started, we thought that was kind of silly. The first group we worked with was pain patients. It was like, how are we going to have an idea about chronic pain patients what they were before. And it's like the whole idea is that if you see a patient, you're not going to be able to assess how they were 3 months or 3 years ago. No reliance on self-report. It's not language-based. A lot of demographics have differences in language and the way they interpret language. The only language involved is which one's bigger, which one came first, which one lasted longer. And that's it. It's agnostic. Like I mentioned, it works with any neurological disorder or any insult, because what you're measuring is brain function and how that brain function's been impacted by something. So yeah, I mentioned why the brain gauge outperforms, and I'm going to go into just mention a couple of these things. One is timing precision, and the other is biological interface. I probably beat that one a little bit, but I'll give you some examples. So let's go on to the next slide. So this is a really interesting study that we published a couple years ago. It did not make us popular with a lot of people, but basically what this graph shows, this is a history of reaction times reported in the literature. So what you have is you got some professor or some group of people doing reaction time on some groups. And they're always comparing them to healthy controls. So if you go through all those papers and you say, okay, what was your reaction time for those people? Now, reaction times are a really simple test. You tap a finger and you respond. It's that simple. Or you flash a visual stimulus up and respond. Or you have a sound and respond. Really simple, and you say, how fast do you respond? So somebody's got a really good reaction time, they're the first ones off the blocks. And basically, what we see here is that between 1850 and 1970, all the reaction times hovered around 200 milliseconds. Then around 1970, look what happened. We have this huge, huge purge of stuff going way up. All the reaction times are getting higher and higher and higher. All right? Anybody want to wager why it got slower in 1970? Personal computers came into existence. And people started saying, the little psychology professor said, hey, I've got a personal computer. I'm going to do a reaction time test. And so he sets up reaction time tests, and he doesn't even know, he doesn't calibrate it. And so people like us were spending hours upon hours before every experiment calibrating our machinery so that we would get really good, precise, and accurate measurements. Now, that's a whole other story, difference between precision and accuracy, but all these guys are like, yeah, I got a new computer, I'm sure it's fast. Saying you're sure it's fast is not the same thing as measuring. And so all this, you see all this drift here, and I did not even show the worst ones. The worst ones were between 1 and 2 seconds. I'm not sure why I left that off. I was embarrassed to show that. I thought there's no way those papers should have been published. Who here has a reaction time of 2 seconds? 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. You gotta be kidding me. You couldn't drive, you couldn't walk across the street without getting hit if your reaction time was that slow. Okay, that's really bad. I mean, studies of severe head trauma, reaction times are around 700 milliseconds. That's severe head trauma. Okay, so all these people are way up here. So what did we do? We published another paper and compared all these different systems people were using and all their different computers. And the bottom line was, number one, we still are publishing around 200 milliseconds. And number two, we tested, because people started saying, oh, if you do this, there's human factors and you can't do this and that and the other. Okay, so we tested robotically. We built some little robotic circuits and hardware, and wasn't a big stretch for us to do that. So robotically, we tested all these things, and the inaccuracies of those systems range between 80 and 400 milliseconds. So if your reaction time should be 200 milliseconds, and all of a sudden you add 400 to it, that's pretty bad. Not only that, the variability is even worse. So that if you test one time and it's 400 milliseconds, the next time you test, right away, it's going to be 300, or it might be 500. Your reaction time is going to be all over the map. And one reason this measure is so important, is because reaction time variability is a really, really good measure for focus and attention, which we've already talked about, focus being a really important measure, because stress and anxiety shoot that out Okay, I'll give you a real quick description of the reaction time test. So you're gonna sit there, and you take the reaction time test, and you basically, you feel a tap and you'll respond with your finger, with left or right hand. And you'll see a number come up on the screen. It might say 200. Oh, okay, that's your reaction time. Then you do it again. You'll do it 10 times, and you'll see your reaction time. 200, 200, 200, 200. If it's 200 every time, that means you have a reaction time of 0. If you have a reaction time of 0, well, there's only like 2 other measures out of 25,000 that have that on our system, but that's really, really good. That means you were focused. You were cutting out all distractions. You were attending really well. You had no problems with that. Okay, so most people, I'd wager in here, are between 5 and 15 milliseconds. So what happens? But most of these other systems, they start up around 80. They can't even measure that. Now, you take a kid with ADHD, you might see a difference. His reaction time variability, he's like all over the place, and it's reaction time variability would, rather than being 200, 200, 200, it might be 260, 200, 140, 200, 260, 300. It's all over the map. So his reaction time variability number is really high because he doesn't have good attention because he's an ADHD kid off his meds. That simple. And we've seen data on and off meds, and that's really, really pretty impressive. When a kid's on his meds, he's much better at that task than others. Okay, biologically based. Let's talk about the biology. Now, we did already talk about excitation and inhibition, but just real quick. When we look at a piece of cortex like this, and we deliver a stimulus to here and here, these are a little bit of electrical stimuli, and you say, oh, look, we can activate these areas. It's really easy to tell the difference between those 2 areas. It's really clean. This is what's going on in your brain when you feel 2 stimuli and you're healthy. All right? Now, let's spritz on a little bit of a GABA antagonist. Turn off a little bit of that inhibition so that now, when you don't have the inhibition is really so important, you can't tell the difference between the 2. And that's the whole basis for the accuracy thing. The accuracy is like, how well can your brain turn that contrast knob? How well can you focus on those little sharp points coming into your brain? And that ability, it gets messed up by a lot of different things. Okay, he must be wrapping it up because he's got these long lists. And yeah, we've done a whole bunch of research. We got 100 plus publications. We're doing research all the time. And just to demonstrate sensitivity, one of the first papers we did a long time ago was on over-the-counter cough syrup. And a lot of this was just because it's like, hey, this is dextromethorphan. Simply to describe anybody that's taken that, hey, this makes me feel goofy. Guess what? We can measure that. It impacts your plasticity, and that's why you feel goofy. Well, there's other reasons too, but drinking behavior, I'm just gonna go through a couple of these. Drinking behavior changes in 18 to 22-year-olds. And we found that plasticity is shot in these kids when they have over 60 drinks per month. Basically, we see changes in brain gauge scores, I mentioned, just about every neurological insult, every neurological disorder. We show responsive therapy very well. It's very good at showing treatment efficacy, and we've got a lot of research that backs that up. Let's go on to, let's just put it in the summary. How does it help? Helps with patient buy-in. I mean, a lot of people that are using a brain gauge, they have their patient sit down in the waiting room, take the test, and say, okay, here's the brain gauge. Just sit down and get comfortable, and it sort of grounds them. It gives them something to do, while they're waiting. And it takes 15 minutes to take the test, and then patient empowerment. They see that their scores are getting better. Treatment efficacy, it allows you to see what treatments are working. So we work with some people that, they use multiple treatments and they see what's working the best. So that gives them a lot of insight. Some treatments will work on some people and some won't work on others. Like getting rid of mold exposure for one patient may work, but it may not work for another. So we've got great examples of that where people were exposed to something, but their tests got much better once that exposure was moved. Research, I say no 2 patients are alike. You've seen one patient, you've seen one patient. And so basically, I talk about research, but most people automatically think research goes on in institutions. The absolute best research comes from people like you. And the whole reason is because, number one, every case study you do adds to the knowledge base. Every study you do. And, if you want to actually be part of something bigger, we really want to build a research platform with the IASIS community. And I know Barry's pretty enthusiastic about that as well. But what we want to do, just imagine, let's compare the academic research venue to, say, a group of people like yourself. And in the academic research venue, you spend about anywhere from $500K to $1 million a year recruiting people into a study, and you might recruit 20 to 30 to 40 people a year into your study, and then you might test them once or twice. So, and are you giving them a treatment? Okay, well, then you would test them a few times each time they're treated. And then you've got to have all kinds of permissions and all kinds of overhead, bureaucratic overhead to do that. What happens when and I've done a lot of studies with clinicians. Well, the clinician basically just tests the person who's coming in their office and compares that data to another clinician who has another patient in the same category, whether it be Alzheimer's or autism or ADHD, and say, okay, which treatment was most effective for which initial condition? Here's the initial condition. We have some objective measures for what that patient looked like. Now let's test them and let's see what impact that has. How long do we need to treat them? Well, it sort of depends on their scores. Depends on the initial conditions, depends on patient compliance, depends on a lot of things. But you could probably have, if you had 20 clinicians in one study, you could easily collect the data it takes 5 years to collect in a university type setting. It would take them 5 years to do it. 20 clinicians could do it in 5 weeks. I mean, it's really remarkable what a network-based versus a centralized-based community can do. Anyway, that's been my goal since the very first 100-pound brain gauge prototype was built. Patient transition to ending treatment. I know a lot of patients feel kind of funny about stopping treatment, but if you convince them, well, maybe it's time to end. Your scores have been really consistent, and we've stretched you've gone from twice a week to once a month, and you're still looking good. Or we can test you, and maybe it is time to treat you again. And actually, the brain gauge does provide a revenue stream. And like if you were to do the subscription plan, it basically covers one or two patient reimbursements would cover the cost of that month. Here's the brain gauge. This is what it looks like. And when you get a brain gauge, pass this around the room, take a look at it. And it really has lost 100 pounds. When you get a brain gauge, we give you a card just like this. And the card is, this is everything you need to know to get started. Those are all the instructions. It's pretty easy tutorial. There is a 1.5-minute tutorial on the Brain Gauge YouTube channel. And I'm putting in a plug for the Brain Gauge YouTube channel now, because basically what it is I'm trying to build a database or video base of answers to questions. If anybody has a question about anything in the neuroscience world, I'll answer it. I don't have the expertise in farming or anything else to answer those questions. But basically, there's tutorials on there for everything. People never believe me. They say, oh, I know, I don't have time. This is hard to unbox or whatever. We do have a tutorial for unboxing. It was made, the whole tutorial was made by the 9-year-old son of the co-founder of the company. And he does a really good job. He says, here, it comes like this, and you take it out, and he does the whole thing. He goes through 5 different tutorials on how to run things. 98% of the people that get a brain gauge don't call us to get it installed and running. They usually call me about questions about the data, which I am more than happy to ask. And I love doing case studies. I love posting them. We're just starting to post them. I like helping people write case studies. So, that's basically what we do. We are what the brain gauge is. It's basically state-of-the-art neuroscience that's been merged with state-of-the-art engineering. And we made it to help people. And that was our altruistic goal. However you want to take that. That was our goal, because we thought, things are too expensive. And putting the power of research tools in people's hands was the way to go, because research tools are cutting edge. I hope you enjoyed learning about the brain gauge. If you have any questions at all, please email me. Anything that goes to info@corticalmetrics.com, that's me. And again, all this information's on the Brain Gauge channel on the YouTube. We have over 100 publications on the website, and I know nobody ever wants to read those. So that's why we started making videos. And if there's a particular topic that was published on that you're interested in, I'll happily make a video on that.